She had learned, very early on, that the easiest way to survive in a room full of dangerous men was to make herself forgettable. Eloise Vane had perfected the art of disappearing in plain sight. She wore muted colors, grey cardigans, navy slacks, nothing that caught light or attention. She kept her hair pinned back, her eyes down. Her footsteps quiet on the marble floors of the Aldercroft Hotel. She had worked the back-office accounting desk for 3 years, and in 3 years, not one of the men who strode through the private entrance on the East Wing had ever looked at her twice. That was exactly how she wanted it. The Aldercroft wasn't just a hotel. Any woman with half a brain and working eyes could figure that out within the first week. The private dining rooms booked under shell company names. The guests who arrived without luggage and left before sunrise. The cash transactions that Eloise was told, firmly and only once, to log under consulting fees and never question. She had nodded, adjusted her glasses, and gone back to her spreadsheets. She wasn't stupid. She was strategic. At 31, Eloise understood something most people her age hadn't yet learned. The safest place to stand in a storm was somewhere nobody thought to look. She wasn't tall, wasn't striking. She was soft in all the ways the world liked to call a flaw. Round cheeks, heavy arms, a body that spilled generously over the edges of whatever the world expected her to fit. She had spent most of her 20s trying to shrink herself. Now she simply used it. People saw the cardigan, the sensible shoes, the quiet girl behind the desk, and they looked away. She let them. What they never noticed was that she remembered everything, every name she overheard, every number that didn't add up, every face that came through the East Wing entrance more than twice, including his. She had first seen Cormac Reyes on a Tuesday in March, when the rain was coming down sideways off Lake Michigan and the lobby smelled like wet wool and cigarette smoke. He walked in like the weather had moved aside for him. No umbrella, no hurry, water beading off a dark coat that cost more than her monthly rent. He was somewhere in his early 40s, she guessed, though it was hard to be certain with men who looked like that. Dark hair gone silver at the temples, a jaw that looked like it had been carved by someone who held grudges. He spoke quietly to the man beside him, and every person in his peripheral vision went very, very still. Eloise had looked back at her monitor before he reached the desk. She did not look up again. She noted him in the margins of her mental ledger and moved on. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. Over the following weeks, she catalogued him the way she catalogued everything, methodically, at a distance, without attachment. Cormac Reyes came in on average twice a week, always through the East Wing, always with the same 2 men flanking him. One with a jaw like a cinder block, who she privately called Granite, and one younger, quick-eyed, who reminded her of a greyhound. She never learned their names. She didn't try to. What she did learn, entirely by accident, was that something in the hotel's books was wrong. Not the consulting fees. Those she already knew were theatre. This was something else. A pattern buried 4 layers deep in the vendor payment system, so elegantly disguised she might have missed it if she hadn't been bored one Thursday afternoon and cross-referencing supply invoices against delivery logs out of pure professional habit. Someone was skimming, not from the hotel, from the men who used the private rooms. The amounts were small, never enough to trigger an automatic flag, but they accumulated. Over 18 months, whoever had built this little architecture had pulled out just over $300,000 in slivers so thin they were nearly invisible. Eloise sat very still at her desk for a long time. Then she closed the file, cleared her screen, and went home. She did not sleep. The problem, she thought, staring at the ceiling of her apartment with her cat, Pepper, curled heavy and warm against her side, was not what she knew. The problem was that she knew it in a building where knowing the wrong thing could end a person's tenure permanently and without paperwork. She'd heard enough in 3 years to understand that much. She could ignore it. She was good at ignoring things. But the accountant in her, The one who had graduated top of her class at Northwestern and taken this job because it paid well and asked few questions. That part of her would not let it go. $300,000. 18 months. Someone patient and careful and already inside. She needed to know who. It took her 11 days. She built a secondary tracking sheet on her personal laptop at home, pulling data from memory rather than the hotel system. She was too careful to leave a trail. She cross-referenced access logs she'd memorized, invoice timestamps, the subtle shift in patterns that always happened when a person was trying not to leave patterns. On a Wednesday night, eating leftover Thai food at her kitchen table, she found him. Aldercroft's own general manager, a man named Philip Braun, who had worked at the hotel for 9 years, and who smiled at everyone with the particular warmth of a person who had decided long ago that charm was cheaper than honesty. He'd built the system slowly, carefully, over the course of a year and a half, and he'd built it against people who did not forgive debts. Eloise set down her fork. She thought about Philip Braun's warm smile, and the men in the private dining rooms and the way sound seemed to thicken and go careful whenever a certain dark-coated man walked in from the East Wing. Then she thought about what happened to people who brought problems to those men's attention. Then she thought about what happened to people those men discovered had been robbed. There was, she realized with a cold, settling clarity, no version of this where she walked away clean. She knew, and once a person knew a thing like this, knowing it was the same as being inside it. She closed her laptop and scratched Pepper behind the ears for a long time. Then she did the most terrifying thing she'd ever done in her careful, quiet, disappearing life. She wrote it all down, not in a way that made sense on its own. She wasn't naive enough to think a document would protect her, but she wrote it in the compressed, precise language of financial forensics, the kind that could only be read properly by someone who understood what they were looking at. Names, dates, amounts, access points, the full architecture from foundation to keystone. She printed it, sealed it in an envelope, and on a Monday morning, 40 minutes before her shift, she walked through the Aldercroft's East Wing entrance for the first time in 3 years, and told the man at the private reception desk, young, expressionless, with the bearing of someone who had stopped being surprised by things, that she needed 5 minutes with whoever was responsible for the accounts on the East Side. The young man looked at her for a moment. "Name," he said. "Eloise Vane. I'm the accountant." He picked up a phone, said 3 words she couldn't hear, set it down. "Wait here," she waited. She stood in the East Wing corridor with her envelope and her sensible shoes and her heart hammering at twice its resting rate. And she reminded herself that she had calculated the risk, that she had made the decision with full information, that panicking now was simply inefficient. It didn't entirely help. The man who came to collect her was Granite, the broad-shouldered one she'd given that name to. Up close he was even larger, and he regarded her with the blank appraisal of a man who had been asked to assess all kinds of unexpected things. He said nothing, just gestured for her to follow. She followed him to a room she hadn't known existed off a corridor she'd never used, and he opened the door and stood aside, and Eloise walked in. The room was spare and dim, a long table and 4 chairs, and one window that looked out on nothing but a grey interior courtyard. Cormac Reyes was standing at the window with his back to her, hands in the pockets of a suit that was charcoal and immaculate, and he didn't turn around when she came in. "You're the accountant," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected, unhurried. "Yes," she said. "You asked to speak to someone about the East Side accounts." "Yes. Most people don't do that. I'm aware." He turned then. He had eyes that were a dark, indeterminate color, and a way of looking at a person that made her feel like he was adding something up. He studied her for a moment without any visible reaction. Not surprise, not dismissal, not the particular kind of blankness that men used when they'd already decided a woman wasn't worth their full attention. He just looked at her, like she was a problem he hadn't encountered before and found, provisionally, interesting. "Sit down," he said. She sat. She put the envelope on the table. He didn't reach for it. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat too, and he looked at the envelope and then at her. "Talk me through it," he said. So she did. She spoke for 20 minutes without notes, because the notes were in the envelope, and the envelope was his if he wanted it. But she didn't need them. She laid out the architecture of what Philip Braun had built, with the precise economy of someone who had spent the better part of 2 weeks living inside it. Amounts, methods, timeline, the particular elegance of the approach, and the particular sloppiness of the exit point that had, eventually, given him away. She did not look away from him while she spoke. She had decided, before walking into this building, that if she was going to do this, she was going to do it like she meant it. When she finished, the room was quiet. Cormac Reyes looked at the envelope on the table. He looked at her. "You could have done nothing," he said. "Yes. Why didn't you?" She considered the honest answer, which was complicated and involved a conversation she'd had with herself at 2 a.m. with a cat on her chest, and gave him the simpler version instead. "Because it was wrong," she said, "and I knew, and knowing made it my problem whether I wanted it to be or not." Something moved very briefly in his expression. Not quite a smile. Something more considered than that. "Leave the envelope," he said. "Go to your desk. Don't tell anyone you came here." She stood. She left the envelope. She walked back out through the corridor and past Granite and through the East Wing entrance and back to her own quiet desk. And she sat down and opened a spreadsheet and stared at it for 40 minutes without seeing a single number. She never saw Philip Braun again after that Thursday. On Friday, the hotel announced that he had resigned for personal reasons, effective immediately. The news was delivered by email at 8 a.m. with a signed farewell from HR, and absolutely no further elaboration. Eloise read the email and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for 2 weeks. She deleted it, opened her workload for the day, and decided firmly that it was over. It was not over. She noticed the changes slowly, the way you notice a shift in air pressure before a storm. Small things. The coffee that appeared on her desk each morning. Decent coffee, not the industrial sludge from the communal machine. She told herself the hotel must have changed their vendor. The fact that the hallway outside her office, which had always had indifferent traffic now, had at least one of Reyes's quiet men visible somewhere on it whenever she was working late. She told herself it was coincidence, that the East Wing had different rhythms, and she'd simply never paid attention before. Then one evening in late April, she was working past 8, trying to reconcile a discrepancy in the quarterly filings, and she stood to get water, and the light in her office was at the particular angle where the glass of her window became a mirror, and she saw him. Cormac Reyes, standing in the corridor outside, talking to Granite in a low voice. Not looking at her window, but positioned exactly where he could see her door. She stood very still with her water glass and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Like someone was watching the door for her. She didn't know what to do with that. She was not a woman men watched doors for. She was the woman who had spent 31 years making herself easy to overlook, and the one time she had walked into a room and asked to be seen. She had done it carrying evidence of a crime, not because she wanted to be noticed. That wasn't the same thing. She told herself it wasn't the same thing. She went home that night and thought about it for an hour, while Pepper watched her from the windowsill with the serene judgment of a creature who had never wasted a single moment on self-deception. "Don't," she told the cat. Pepper looked away. 3 weeks later, a Wednesday morning in mid-May, Eloise arrived at work at her usual time, 7:45, 20 minutes before anyone else in back-office accounting, and found the corridor outside her department blocked by 2 uniformed police officers, and 3 men she didn't recognize in suits that had the particular stiffness of federal. Her first thought was very simple. Find out what happened before you react. Her second thought, arriving half a second behind the first. Where is Reyes? She didn't get the chance to answer either. Something hit her from behind. Not a fist, more like a shoulder, a body moving fast in a narrow space, and the floor tilted, and the corridor lights went sideways, and she had a single, clear thought, this is going to be loud, before the darkness came up to meet her. She woke up cold. That was the first thing. The cold, specifically the damp cold of concrete, and the sound of water moving somewhere far below, industrial and rhythmic. Her wrists were bound behind her, not tightly enough to cut circulation, but firmly enough to matter, and there was something over her eyes. Cloth, not a blindfold, more like a scarf folded over, and the chair she was sitting in had one leg slightly shorter than the others, a wobble she could feel every time she shifted her weight. Her head hurt, her left shoulder hurt more. She breathed. She was an accountant. She solved problems with information. She needed information, sounds. Water below, machinery, far off or heavily insulated. Voices, two of them, male, speaking low enough that she could catch cadence but not content. The echoes suggested high ceilings, industrial, smells, salt water, machine oil, cigarette smoke, old, embedded in the space rather than present, the wobbling chair leg. One of her shoes had come half off in the fall. She catalogued. She breathed. She did not panic. Then one of the voices said, clearly and close, "She's awake." The blindfold was pulled away. The light was bad, bare bulbs, industrial orange, but after the darkness it made her eyes water sharply. She blinked until the space assembled itself. A warehouse, half empty, brick walls weeping with moisture. Lake access, she thought, from the sound and the smell. Chicago waterfront, somewhere south of the loop, where the commercial piers were still working. Two men, neither of them anyone she recognized. The closer one crouched down to her eye level. He had a narrow face and the eyes of someone who found other people's distress genuinely interesting. "Elores Vane," he said. "You're a hard woman to find. For an accountant." "I work regular hours," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "You should have just called." He smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "Where are the records?" he said. She understood then. This wasn't about her. This was about whoever had hired Philip Braun to do what Philip Braun had done. Someone upstream. Someone who'd had a piece of that careful skimming and hadn't expected their pipeline to disappear so suddenly and was now backtracking to find where the documentation had gone, the records she had given to Cormac Reyes. "What records?" she said. He hit her. Not hard, controlled, the way a person hits when they want to communicate capability rather than actually do damage. Her head snapped sideways and her cheek bloomed with heat, and she tasted copper at the corner of her lip. She straightened, looked at him. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. He studied her for a moment. Then he stood and took a few steps back and made a call. Eloise breathed. She catalogued the wobbling leg. She thought very carefully about the fact that Cormac Reyes's men had been outside her office, thought about what that meant about response time, thought about what Granite had looked like when he assessed situations. Cool, systematic, efficient. They'll be looking, she thought. They just need to find the right pier. She needed to be alive when they did. "I already told the hotel's legal team," she said loudly. To the back of the narrow-faced man, he turned. "I brought the records to accounting legal," she continued. "Standard procedure when you discover financial irregularities. I'm an accountant. That's protocol. They've had copies since the first week." She watched his face. "Which means whatever you're planning to get from me doesn't exist anymore. Not in a way that only I can access." He wasn't sure. She could see it. The flicker of calculation. The problem of not being able to verify the lie quickly enough to know if it was a lie. She gave him nothing else to read. She made her face the same face she wore at her desk. Quiet, neutral. The expression of a woman who was not worth looking at twice. Buy time, she thought. Just buy time. She heard the door before she heard anything else. Not a knock. A sound like a door being made not to matter. A short, percussive concussion that she felt in her sternum. And then the warehouse folded open into noise and motion, and the cold night air came rushing in from the south wall, and there were lights and voices, and the narrow-faced man had turned away from her completely, and the second man was already down. She closed her eyes. She pressed her back against the chair and kept very still, and breathed through her nose and waited. The noise was short. That was what struck her afterward. How short it was, when she'd been bracing for something that lasted, maybe 40 seconds of chaos, and then a particular quality of silence that meant it was finished. Footsteps. Coming toward her, she opened her eyes. Cormac Reyes stood in front of her. He looked wrong, not physically. He was composed the way she'd always seen him, coat dark, posture controlled, but something in his face was not composed. Something behind the eyes that she had never seen there before, not in any of the glimpses she'd catalogued from her careful distance, not in the meeting where she'd laid financial crimes on the table between them and watched him decide what to do with her. He looked at her face, at her cheek, where the hit had landed, and his jaw did something. "Are you hurt?" he said. His voice was not unhurried. "My shoulder," she said, "and my cheek. I'm okay." He crouched in front of her, and his hands moved to the binding at her wrists, and she felt the careful way he worked at it. Not yanking, not impatient, precise and controlled even now. And when the binding came free, he didn't step away immediately. He stayed where he was and looked at her wrists, checking the skin, and then he looked at her face again with that same expression she didn't have a name for yet. "I had the South Piers," he said quietly. "We were working north." "I know," she said. "I was buying time." Something moved in his face. "The thing you said, about legal protocol." He looked at her steadily. "That wasn't true." "No," she agreed. But he didn't know that. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, very low, "You sat in a warehouse, bound, in the dark, and you ran a deliberate disinformation strategy to stall him." "I'm an accountant," she said. "I solve problems with the information I have." He looked at her for a long moment. Then Granite appeared at his shoulder and said quietly, "We need to move." And Cormac Reyes stood without looking away from her and held out his hand. She took it. She stood. Her legs were unsteady, and she was not going to say so, but he seemed to understand anyway, because his hand stayed at her elbow. Not gripping, just present, as they walked toward the blown-open wall and the cold Chicago air. Outside, 2 black vehicles, engines running, the waterfront at night, the lake black and enormous and indifferent. She could smell the rain coming in from the north. He opened the door of the first vehicle, and she got in and he got in after her, and the door closed and the city moved past the windows, and neither of them spoke for a long time. She became aware, slowly, that her hands were shaking, not much, but enough. She pressed them flat against her thighs and stared at the lake through the window and reminded herself, in the precise internal voice she used for difficult reconciliations, that she had made a risk calculation, and the calculation had been correct, and the situation was resolved. "You're shaking," he said. "I know," she said. "I'll stop." She felt his gaze. Not uncomfortable, she had noticed before that his attention didn't have the quality that most men's attention had, the weight of assessment and dismissal layered together. He simply looked at her, the way you looked at something you were genuinely trying to understand. "You're not going back to the hotel," he said. She turned to look at him. "Not because of anything you've done," he said. "Because they know who you are now, the people who hired Braun. They'll know you were the one who surfaced this. It's not safe." She thought about this. She thought about her desk, her spreadsheets, her carefully maintained invisibility. "My cat," she said. He blinked. The first time she'd ever seen him blink with anything other than intention. "My cat is at my apartment," she said. "Pepper, she needs to be fed." A pause. "I'll have someone collect her," he said. "She doesn't like strangers." "I'll have someone?" She'll tolerate. She almost said something about how he couldn't possibly know what Pepper would tolerate. But she looked at his face and thought that he was probably the kind of man who, if he said he would handle something, had already worked out the relevant details. "Okay," she said. The vehicle moved through the city. The rain started, quiet at first, then steady, running in long lines down the windows. She watched it and thought about the fact that she had spent 3 years making herself invisible, and the one time she had stepped deliberately into view, she had apparently stepped somewhere she hadn't anticipated. "Why were your men outside my office?" she said. He didn't answer immediately. She had noticed he did that, held space before speaking, as if he considered language the way other people considered infrastructure, something that should bear weight without failing. "I looked into you," he said, "after you came to me in March. You background checked me. Yes, and you graduated top of your undergraduate class, declined 2 offers from Big 4 firms to take a position that paid significantly less but let you work alone. You have no outstanding debt. You keep a very small social circle. You bring lunch from home every day." A pause. "You are the most financially ethical person who has ever worked in that building." She stared at him. "That worried me," he said. "Why?" "Because ethical people in proximity to my operations create unpredictable outcomes." Something shifted in his face. "You were an unpredictable outcome I hadn't accounted for, so I watched to make sure you were safe." The city moved past. The rain came down. Eloise thought, very carefully, about a man who ran an empire built on violence and secrecy, who had seen a quiet accountant walk into his room with an envelope, and had decided, in whatever calculus operated behind those dark eyes, that she was worth keeping safe. Not because she was useful to him. She had already given him everything useful she had. Because she was ethical. Because she was unpredictable. Because something in him had registered her and not let go. She didn't know what to do with that. "You could have just asked me," she said finally. "Asked you what? To stay safe. You could have told me there might be blowback. Given me some warning." She looked at him. Instead of watching from hallways, his jaw shifted. The thing that wasn't quite guilt in someone who probably hadn't felt guilt in a long time. "You're right," he said. She hadn't expected that. She turned to look at him fully. "I didn't want you to be frightened," he said very quietly. "I thought if you didn't know, you'd stay in the pattern you'd established. Invisible. Unremarkable. Safe. That's not your decision," she said. "No," he agreed. It wasn't. The vehicle was slowing, an address she didn't recognize, a building with a discreet canopy, and a doorman who clearly knew the car. Somewhere north of the Gold Coast. She looked out the window. "I'm not invisible," she said. Not to him exactly. More to the rain on the glass, to herself, to the version of herself she'd spent a decade trying to make as small as possible. "I've been pretending to be. It's different." She felt him go still beside her. "I know you're not," he said. She turned. He was looking at her with that same expression she hadn't had a name for. And she looked at it long enough this time to start to understand what it was. Not assessment, not calculation. The particular, complicated look of a person who has known something for longer than they've been willing to say it. "I've known you weren't invisible for a long time," he said. "Since you walked into that room in March." Before that, a pause that had weight. "I noticed you before you ever noticed me noticing." She sat very still with the rain on the window and her shaking hands flat against her thighs, and the ache in her shoulder, and the warmth where he had held her elbow on the waterfront. "You have a strange way of showing it," she said. "Yes," he said. The door opened. Granite, outside in the rain, waiting. Cormac Reyes stepped out and offered his hand. She looked at it. She looked at him. She thought about calculated risks and unpredictable outcomes, and 3 years of making herself easy to miss. She took his hand. She stepped out into the rain. It was cold and immediate and real, and he didn't let go, and she didn't ask him to. "My cat," she said. First thing, he agreed. They walked into the building together, and the door closed behind them, and somewhere south of the loop, the waterfront sat empty and cold, and the lake went on and on in the dark, the way it always had, enormous and indifferent to the small, consequential things that happened on its shores. Pepper arrived 40 minutes later, carrier and all, delivered by the greyhound-quick young man, who had, apparently, won her over with a very specific brand of salmon-flavored treat. She emerged from the carrier, inspected the room with imperial disdain, and chose Cormac Reyes's armchair. He looked at the cat in his chair for a long moment. "She doesn't like strangers," Eloise said. "She liked Marco," he said. Marco brought bribes, effective strategy. Eloise stood in the middle of a room that wasn't hers and looked at a man who had watched her hallways and moved fleets of cars and held her elbow in the rain, and she thought, "This is not the life I planned." She thought, "I planned a life built on not being seen," she thought. "I am so tired of not being seen." "I want to know," she said, "everything I'm walking into. I'm not doing this without information." "That's not negotiable." He looked at her. "I'll tell you everything you want to know," he said. "Everything," she said. "Not a curated version, not whatever you decide I can handle." Something in his expression that might, on a different face, have been called moved. "Everything," he said. She nodded. She sat on the couch. She looked at her cat in the chair of the most dangerous man she'd ever met, purring like a small engine entirely at peace. "Okay," she said. "Start talking."